At 2:13 a.m., Adrian Vale, the man who struck fear into the city, sat alone in the darkness, his hand trembling as he held his phone. He didn't call his lawyer. He didn't call his security team. He called her. And as Selene Arden stepped into that cold penthouse, with soaking wet sneakers and a worn-out sweater, she didn't know that a single word uttered in the pouring rain would draw her into an empire of crime, a sham marriage, and a love powerful enough to burn everything she knew. If you enjoy stories of love born from the shadows, watch until the end. Like, leave a comment with the city you're watching in. Let me know how far this story has come. The rain had been falling for 6 hours straight when Selene Arden got the call. She was still awake. She rarely slept well before midnight, sitting cross-legged on her apartment couch with a book split open across her knees and a mug of cold tea on the cushion beside her. The television murmured low in the background, some late-night program she wasn't watching. Outside her window, New Carthage looked like a city being slowly drowned, streetlights smearing gold across black pavement, rain hammering the glass in rhythmic, relentless waves. Her phone lit up. She looked at the name on the screen and went completely still. Adrian Vale didn't call people. He summoned them. He sent drivers, assistants, terse messages through encrypted channels. In the 11 years Selene had worked as a financial consultant inside the orbit of the Vale Syndicate, and the 2 years before that, when she'd first met him through a mutual contact at a charity gala she never should have attended. She could count on one hand the number of times he'd dialed her directly. She picked up on the third ring. Adrian. Silence. Then breathing. Shallow and uneven, like a man who'd been holding something back for hours and was only now discovering he couldn't hold it anymore. I need you here. His voice was wrong, stripped of the controlled precision she'd grown used to. The version of Adrian Vale that boardrooms feared and rivals studied like a military manual was completely absent. What was left in its place sounded raw and exhausted and somehow smaller than she'd ever heard him. Please. That single word, please, hit her like a fist. Adrian Vale did not say please. She closed the book without marking her page, set the cold tea on the floor, and reached for her coat. The penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of the Harrow Tower, a glass and steel monument to controlled excess that rose above everything else in the New Carthage financial district, like a needle aimed at the clouds. Selene had been inside it dozens of times for business. She knew the elevator code, the layout, the way the floor-to-ceiling windows made the whole city feel like a diorama built for Adrian's private viewing. But she'd never been there at 2 a.m. on the night of a funeral. The security team waved her through without speaking. She rode the elevator up in silence, watching her own reflection in the polished steel doors. Wet hair, oversized gray sweater, sneakers leaving small dark prints on the floor. She looked completely out of place and she knew it, and for one disorienting moment she thought about pressing the button for the lobby and going back home. Then the doors opened. The penthouse was dark except for the ambient glow of the city bleeding through the windows. The rain sheeted against the glass in long diagonal streaks. Selene stepped out and stood very still, letting her eyes adjust, and that was when she saw him. Adrian was sitting in the far corner of the main room, in the deep leather chair that faced the windows. He still wore the black suit from the funeral. She'd seen photographs on her phone earlier that evening, press coverage of the service. Though his jacket was gone now, tie loosened, the top 2 buttons of his shirt undone in a way that suggested the formality had been physically unbearable, and he'd shed it the moment he was alone. His elbows were on his knees. His head was bowed. He looked like a man in the middle of a collapse that hadn't fully arrived yet. Selene crossed the room slowly. She didn't turn on lights. She sat down on the ottoman facing him, close enough to see the tension in his jaw, the slight redness around his eyes that he would have hated her noticing. "When did you last eat something?" she asked. "That's not why I called." "I know why you called. I'm asking anyway." He looked up at her. His eyes, dark gray, the color of wet concrete, eyes she had spent years learning not to look at too directly, were exhausted in a way that went beyond physical. There was something undone in his expression, something she wasn't used to seeing on a face that was usually as readable as a stone wall. "This morning," he said finally, "before the service." Okay. She stood, moved toward his kitchen, and started searching cabinets with the efficiency of someone who'd spent enough time in this building to know where things were. She found bread, found eggs, found a pan. She didn't ask permission. He didn't object. Behind her, she heard him shift in the chair. the creak of leather, the sound of a man who couldn't quite settle into stillness. By the time she brought a plate back and set it on the table beside him, he was staring at the rain again. "She left a will," he said. Selene sat back down. She waited. Of course she left a will. He reached for the plate with automatic courtesy, picked up the fork, and then set it back down without eating. She left a will that reads like a grenade, like she planned this from the moment she got the diagnosis. Selene had met Mara Vale exactly 3 times. Adrian's grandmother had been in her late 80s, sharp-eyed, dressed in immaculate charcoal gray every occasion, with the specific kind of stillness that powerful women sometimes cultivated. The stillness of a person who had learned very young that explosions were more effective when they came without warning. The Vale Syndicate had been hers before it was Adrian's. She had built it across 4 decades from a regional distribution network into something that controlled legitimate financial institutions, import infrastructure, and an entire shadow economy that moved behind the visible city like blood behind skin. She had also been, by every account, completely ruthless. "What does it say?" Selene asked. Adrian finally looked at her directly. His jaw tightened. "I have 6 months to be married. I have to remain married for 5 years." He paused. "Or the Empire transfers to Vivian." The name landed in the room like something heavy dropped on concrete. Selene knew Vivian Vale the way you knew a weather pattern. Not personally, not closely, but with the instinctive awareness that when she appeared on the horizon, damage was coming. Adrian's cousin. 34 years old, Yale-educated, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, and a documented history of dismantling the careers of people who underestimated her. She had been circling the Vale Syndicate for years, positioning herself in subcommittees and satellite operations, building a constituency among the older board members who thought Adrian was too careful, too deliberate, too unwilling to use the methods they were accustomed to. She would burn the entire operation to the ground before she let it modernize. 6 months, Selene repeated. 6 months. "And you don't have anyone—" She stopped herself. "No. Flat. Final. I don't." That wasn't entirely surprising. Adrian Vale's personal life was not the subject of speculation among people who valued their positions. What was understood quietly was that he kept his distance from people by design. The few relationships she'd seen him adjacent to over the years had been brief and clearly provisional, the kind that ended when they became inconvenient. He was not a man who let people in. She had spent years studying that particular quality in him and still wasn't entirely sure whether it was armor or architecture, whether he'd built the walls consciously or whether he'd simply been built that way. The rain hit the windows. The city glowed below them like something vast and indifferent. "You could find someone," she said carefully. "In 6 months, Selene." The way he said her name made her go quiet immediately. Not because it was sharp. Because it wasn't. It was tired in a way she didn't have a category for. "I can't put a stranger into this situation," he said. "You know what my life looks like. You know what the next 6 months are going to look like, with Vivian and the board and—" He pressed 2 fingers between his eyes. "Anyone I tried to marry quickly would need protection, briefing, security, a legal architecture around them before the ink dried. Anyone I trust enough to do that with is already too deep inside the operation to be exposed further without risk. That's a very organized way to explain why you called me at 2 in the morning." He looked at her. She looked at him. The rain was very loud. "Marry me," she said. She didn't fully understand that she'd said it out loud until she watched his expression change. The words had come from somewhere she hadn't examined. They had bypassed whatever filter she normally maintained around Adrian Vale, the professional distance, the careful delineation she'd maintained for years between what she felt and what she allowed herself to acknowledge feeling, and they had arrived in the air between them before she could intercept them. For a moment, neither of them moved. "Selene, as a business arrangement," she said quickly. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "Contractual, time-limited, a legal marriage that fulfills your grandmother's conditions and protects the succession. I know your operation well enough to be credible. I can hold up under scrutiny, and I know how to keep my mouth shut." He stared at her. The muscle in his jaw worked. "You understand what you'd be agreeing to." "I understand what I'd be agreeing to. The exposure, the security requirements, the fact that Vivian will immediately try to find a way to invalidate it. He leaned forward slightly. She'll dig into your life, Selene. Everything. She'll try to find leverage. She'll have people following you within days of any announcement. I know. And you're still... I said yes, Adrian. She held his gaze. Stop waiting for me to change my mind. Something moved through his expression. Something she didn't allow herself to name. Okay, he said quietly. Neither of them slept that night. The courthouse wedding happened 4 days later, on a gray Thursday morning that smelled of rain and exhaust. No ceremony, no flowers, no invitation list or catered reception or dress chosen with care. Selene bought something cream-colored off a rack in under 40 minutes the day before. A simple sheath dress that was appropriate and anonymous. The kind of thing that would read well in photographs without suggesting she'd given it meaningful thought. She told herself that was strategic. She told herself that was fine. Adrian wore a charcoal suit. He always wore charcoal suits. He looked, as he nearly always looked, like a man who had been constructed specifically to occupy expensive rooms without appearing uncomfortable in them. Controlled jaw, controlled posture, the kind of physical containment that came from a lifetime of understanding that visible emotion was a liability. They stood before a civil magistrate in a small government office on the 4th floor of the new Carthage City Hall, while 3 armed security personnel stood at the single entrance, and a Vale syndicate attorney reviewed paperwork in the corner with the focused disengagement of someone billing by the minute. "Do you—" the magistrate began. "Yes," Adrian said. "And do you—" "Yes," Selene said. They signed. The kiss lasted 2 seconds. She felt the warmth of his mouth, the deliberate restraint in the way he pulled back, the gap of controlled air he put between them immediately afterward. His hand touched her waist briefly during the kiss, and then withdrew as if the contact had been accounted for and completed. When she looked up at him, his face was unreadable. Outside, rain again. There was always rain in New Carthage. The penthouse had a second bedroom. That was where Selene's belongings went. Moved in by Adrian's security team the same afternoon, boxed and transported with the same efficiency they applied to everything else. Her books appeared on the shelves in the guest room. Her laptop appeared on the guest desk. Her coat appeared on the hook near the elevator in a way that looked, if you walked past quickly, almost natural. The first night was extraordinarily awkward in a way that neither of them acknowledged. They ate dinner across from each other at the long kitchen island. Takeout from a restaurant Selene had mentioned once in passing that she liked. She noticed he'd remembered and chose not to say anything about it. And they talked about the meeting scheduled for the following week with the Vale board, the documentation they'd need to present, the questions they should anticipate. Business. Clean and manageable and entirely beside the point. She went to bed at 11. She heard him moving around the penthouse past 2 in the morning. By the end of the first week, certain patterns had established themselves without discussion. Adrian made coffee every morning at 6:15. He made it strong and slightly too hot, the way she'd once mentioned she preferred it, and he set a second cup on the kitchen island every morning without appearing to think about it. She stopped mentioning it after the 3rd day because every time she did, something in his expression closed off in a way that felt like a warning. She learned he had nightmares. Not just restless sleep, actual nightmares. The kind that woke him with a sound she could hear through the walls, a short, sharp exhale like he'd been punched, followed by a long silence, followed by the sound of him moving to the kitchen. She never came out. She told herself that was the correct choice. Some mornings she could tell by the set of his shoulders at breakfast which nights had been bad. He learned that she read during anxiety the way other people cleaned or exercised, compulsively, without retention, just the physical sensation of words passing through her eyes to give the anxious energy somewhere to go. He started leaving books on the kitchen island, novels she hadn't read, nothing with a note attached, just there in the morning when she came down. She didn't ask where they came from. He didn't offer. The boardroom presentation went well. Vivian Vale sat across the table with 2 of her supporters on the Vale board and watched everything with that particular quality of stillness that meant she was cataloging rather than reacting. She asked 3 pointed questions about the marriage timeline, and Selene answered all 3 without hesitation, which she could tell annoyed Vivian significantly more than uncertainty would have. Afterward, in the elevator, Adrian stood beside her and said very quietly, "You were good in there." "Thank you. I mean that." "I know." She looked at the elevator doors. So did I. She could feel him almost smile. The almost smile was something she'd trained herself not to focus on over the years. It was becoming harder to maintain that discipline in close quarters. The first threat arrived 3 weeks into the marriage. It came in the form of an envelope left on Celine's car, her own car, parked in the building's secured garage, which meant someone had access they shouldn't have. Inside was a single photograph, printed on plain paper, showing Selene entering a coffee shop 2 blocks from her old apartment. The timestamp on the image was from 5 days before the wedding. Below the photograph, one typed line. "We know what this is." She brought it to Adrian without deliberating about it. He read the note. He looked at the photograph. He set both down on the kitchen island with the careful, neutral expression she'd come to understand meant he was more alarmed than he was going to show. "Vivienne," she said. "Almost certainly." He pulled out his phone. "Or someone working for her. Either way." He was already dialing. "I'm having the garage security reviewed. I want 2 additional personnel on your personal movement for the next 2 weeks. I don't need Selene." He looked up from the phone, something in his eyes that she couldn't fully categorize. "Don't argue with me about this." She didn't. That night, after the security team's sweep of the building was completed and the garage footage had been pulled for analysis, Selene sat alone in the guest room with a book open in her lap that she wasn't reading. Through the wall, she could hear the muffled sound of Adrian on the phone. Low, controlled, the voice he used when he was managing a situation and didn't want anyone to see the edges of how much he was managing. She thought about the 2 seconds of that courthouse kiss. She thought about how carefully he'd moved away. She picked up her book and read the same paragraph 4 times without registering a word. The weeks accumulated. November passed into December. The city outside their windows shifted through rain into a brief, bitter cold that glazed everything in ice. Selene's law firm continued to operate. She'd been careful, from the beginning, to keep her professional life intact and separate, partly as a matter of principle, and partly because she understood intuitively that she needed something outside the penthouse that was entirely hers. But the penthouse was changing around her in ways she couldn't fully track. Her handwriting appeared on the grocery list on the refrigerator. His playlists bled into the speakers in the morning. There was a throw blanket on the couch that she'd bought without thinking, and he'd started using on the nights he fell asleep reading. Small accumulations. Domestic sediment. The kind of thing that happened when 2 people shared a space that was designed for one, and neither of them had established clear enough rules about which territory belonged to whom. She was making tea in the kitchen one Wednesday night in December when she heard him come in from a meeting that had run late. She could tell the meeting had been difficult from the particular quality of silence he carried when he pushed the door open, a silence that had weight to it, that was doing work. He came to stand on the other side of the kitchen island, and she slid a second mug toward him without looking up. He stood there for a moment. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "It's tea, Adrian, not a declaration." "I know what it is." Quiet. She finally looked up. He was watching her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Something uncertain. Something she would have said he was incapable of before she'd spent 2 months watching him in unguarded moments through the walls of the same apartment. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something he didn't know the depth of. She looked away first. "Drink it," she said. "It's getting cold." He drank it. They stood in the kitchen in silence for a while, and outside the city hummed its enormous indifferent hum, and neither of them said what was accumulating in the room between them, like a third presence that neither of them was willing to look at directly. The photographs showing up in the press were Vivienne's next move, 3 of them planted in a tabloid that covered New Carthage's financial elite with a particular appetite for scandal. The images showed Adrian entering a hotel, the Meridian, 12 blocks from Harrow Tower, on 2 separate occasions. The timestamps placed both visits at late evening. The article that ran alongside them was carefully worded, legally untouchable, speculative in just the right way to be maximally damaging. Sources close to the Vale family questioned the sincerity of the heir's recent marriage. Selene saw it on her phone over lunch at her office. She read it twice. Then she sat very still for approximately 90 seconds, processing the cold, specific anger that moved through her. And then she got her coat and walked out of her office and kept walking until she was in a taxi headed for the Meridian. She didn't call ahead. She shouldn't have been there. Every rational part of her understood that she was acting on a feeling she didn't have the right to act on. This was a business arrangement. This was a contract. He owed her nothing beyond the terms they'd agreed to, and if she arrived at that hotel and found exactly what the tabloid was suggesting, she was going to feel foolish and exposed, and she was going to have to dismantle whatever it was she'd apparently been building in the privacy of her own chest without her full awareness. She pushed through the hotel's lobby doors anyway. She found out his room from a member of Adrian's security team who recognized her, and after a brief moment of clear discomfort, gave her the number. She took the elevator up. She knocked on the door harder than she'd intended. It opened. Adrian stood in the doorway looking startled in a way she'd never seen before. Actually startled, the controlled composure momentarily displaced by the simple fact of her being there. Behind him, seated in one of the room's chairs, was a woman Selene didn't recognize. 50s. Professional clothing. A notepad on the table beside her, and a pen in her hand, and an expression that was professionally neutral, and somehow also communicating that she'd seen this specific scenario before. Selene looked at the woman. She looked at Adrian. "This is Dr. Reyes," Adrian said. His voice had gone careful in a way that was different from his usual careful, more exposed. "She's been my therapist for 8 months. The silence in the doorway was enormous. Selene felt the specific quality of her own assumptions dissolving. "I didn't want anyone at the syndicate knowing," Adrian continued, quietly, almost inaudibly. "I didn't want Vivian to have... I didn't want it used," he paused. "I should have told you." Selene stared at him. There were a dozen things she could have said, professional things, reasonable things, things that fit inside the terms of their arrangement and kept her safely on the right side of the line she'd spent 2 months trying to maintain. What came out instead was, "What do you talk about?" He held her gaze. And then, in the voice of a man dismantling something that had taken years to build, he said, "You, mostly." The world rearranged itself. Selene stood in the doorway of that hotel room while the city hummed 8 stories below them, and Dr. Reyes made a quiet excuse to give them the room, and she looked at Adrian Vale, the man she'd married for business, the man whose nightmares she'd listened to through the walls, the man who left books on kitchen islands and made her coffee the exact right temperature, and understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that she had made a catastrophic error. Not in marrying him, in believing for even a single day that it was something she could keep from meaning anything. "I need to say something," Adrian said. His voice had gone rough in a way she'd never heard before. "And I need you to let me finish before you... Adrian, I'm in love with you." He said it the way a man says something he's been holding back until holding it had become physically painful. "I've been in love with you since before any of this, since before the will and the arrangement, and..." He stopped, swallowed. 13 years ago, the first time you told me exactly what you thought of a financial decision I'd made, which everyone else in the room was too afraid to do. The corner of his mouth moved. "You were the only person in the room who treated me like someone who could handle the truth." The rain had started again outside the windows. Selene's throat felt like it was full of something she couldn't speak around. "Pretending this means nothing," he said quietly, "is the hardest thing I've done in my life. And I've done some genuinely terrible things." She crossed the room. She didn't plan it. There was no decision made. There was just the distance between them, and then there wasn't. And then her hands were on either side of his face, and she kissed him the way you kiss someone when you've been drowning for years and you finally stopped pretending the surface doesn't exist. He went still for half a second that felt like the whole world catching its breath. And then his arms came around her with a kind of quiet desperation, and the kiss deepened into something that had nothing to do with contracts or arrangements or the carefully maintained architecture of professional distance. Outside, New Carthage drowned in rain. Inside that hotel room, something that had been building for 13 years finally broke open and refused to be anything other than what it was. When they finally separated, both breathing unsteadily, Selene pressed her forehead against his. "I should have said something a long time ago," she managed. "So should I." His hands were still in her hair. "We've both been catastrophically stupid. Don't push it." He almost laughed. The almost laugh was more undoing than anything else. She thought, this changes everything. She didn't yet know how completely she was right. 3 days later, an envelope arrived at the penthouse, not slipped under a car door, not planted on a press tip line, hand-delivered by a courier to the Harrow Tower front desk at 9 in the morning, addressed to Selene Arden Vale in typed black letters with no return address. She opened it alone, standing at the kitchen island while Adrian was on a call in the next room. Inside was a single sheet of paper, medical documentation. A clinical record, partially redacted, with her name and a date circled in red. Beneath it, a note in the same clean type. $50 million. 3 days. Or the Vale Board gets proof this marriage is a fraud, and something else besides. She read the note twice, then she looked at the medical record, and understood what something else besides meant. Her hands were completely steady. That frightened her slightly. The stillness of her hands, the calm that arrived before the full weight of the thing arrived behind it. Adrian's voice from the next room, finishing his call. The sound of the door opening. She folded the note carefully along its original crease. She thought about the last 3 days, the hotel room, his hands in her hair, the specific quality of what had finally become real between them. She thought about $50 million and 3 days and the word fraud and what Vivian Vale would do with any of it. She thought about the medical record and the date and what it meant and what Adrian didn't know yet. She set the paper down on the kitchen island, and when Adrian walked through the door, coffee in hand, eyes still warm from 3 mornings of something new and real and entirely unprepared for the world outside their windows, she looked up at him and understood that the next words out of her mouth were going to change everything again. She didn't tell him right away. That was the first mistake. She understood it was a mistake even as she made it, felt the wrongness of the choice settle into her chest like swallowed glass. But Adrian walked through that kitchen door with coffee steam curling off the mug and the particular loosened quality in his face that had only appeared in the last 3 days. Something she'd never seen before the hotel room. Something that looked almost like ease. And she couldn't do it. She folded the envelope once more and slid it into the pocket of her cardigan. "You look like you haven't slept," he said. "I slept fine." He looked at her for a beat too long. Something in his eyes that she didn't examine. "Board call at 9, he said. "I know." He set a mug of coffee on the island in front of her. The right temperature, the right strength, the same way he'd been making it for 2 months. And she wrapped both hands around it and focused on the heat against her palms, and not on the folded paper in her pocket, and not on the date circled in red on the medical record, and not on what it meant that someone knew before she'd processed it herself. "After the call," Adrian said, turning back toward the counter, "I want to go over the Vivian situation. There's a board meeting scheduled for the 14th, and I have reason to believe she's going to push for a formal review of the marriage's legitimacy." "On what grounds?" "She doesn't need strong grounds. She needs enough to force a review period, which ties up succession authority while the board deliberates." He poured his own coffee. "I want to be 3 steps ahead of whatever she brings." "Okay. Are you all right?" "Yes." He turned around. She met his eyes steadily. His jaw moved slightly. The tell she'd cataloged, the one that meant he was deciding whether to push, and then he let it go. She hated that she'd made him let it go. The board call lasted 90 minutes. Selene sat beside Adrian at the dining table that served as his home office, both of them on camera, the faces of 6 board members arranged in a grid on the screen. She watched Vivian in the bottom right square. Composed, silk blouse, posture that communicated patient certainty, and felt the pressure of the envelope in her pocket the whole time like a bruise being pressed. After the call ended, Adrian closed the laptop and sat back. "She said almost nothing," he said. "That's worse than if she'd said something." "I know." Selene stood. "I have client work this afternoon. I'll be back by 7. He caught her wrist before she was fully around the table. Not hard. His grip was light, questioning, but she went still anyway. "Something's off," he said quietly. Not an accusation, more like a man who'd spent 2 months learning the specific texture of her silences and was now encountering one he didn't recognize. She looked at his hand on her wrist. "I'm fine, Adrian." "You said that already." "Because it's still true." A beat. He let go. She left. Welcome. In the elevator going down, she finally took the envelope out of her pocket and looked at it again. the medical record. Her name, the date, the note beneath it with its 3 brutal lines and its $50 million demand and its weaponized knowledge of something she hadn't told a single person yet because there hadn't been time and because she'd needed to be sure and because even now, holding the paper, some part of her was still in the process of being sure. The elevator reached the lobby. She put the envelope back in her pocket and walked out into the cold. Her first call was to Marcus Webb. Marcus had been her lawyer, personal, not professional, for 6 years, and more relevantly, he had spent 8 of those years before her acquaintance as a federal prosecutor. He understood the architecture of threats. He picked up on the second ring. "I need to meet today," she said, walking fast through the financial district with her coat collar up against the wind. "Somewhere that isn't my office or the Harrow Tower." A pause. "How serious?" "Serious enough that I'm calling you instead of handling it myself." "The coffee place on Mercer, 1 o'clock." She was there at 12:45. Marcus arrived at 1 exactly, which was the kind of punctuality she'd always appreciated in him, reliable without being performative. He was a big man, unhurried in his movements, with the kind of face that gave nothing away reflexively, which was probably what had made him a good prosecutor. She handed him the envelope across the small table. He read it. He read it again. He set it down and looked at her. "When did this arrive?" "This morning." "Does Adrian know?" A pause that lasted slightly too long. "No," she said. Marcus absorbed this without visible judgment, which she also appreciated. "The medical record? Is it legitimate?" "Yes." "And Adrian doesn't know about that either?" "No." He folded his hands on the table. Outside on Mercer Street, pedestrians moved past the window in both directions, bundled against the cold, oblivious. "Selene, talk me through the timeline." She talked him through the timeline, all of it. The clinical confirmation she'd received 10 days ago, the decision to wait until she was certain, the hotel room 3 days ago, and what had shifted between her and Adrian, and then this morning, and the envelope, and the $50 million, and the 3 days. Marcus listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The leak had to come from inside a medical facility," he said, "which means someone accessed protected records. That's a federal offense. The problem is that proving it takes time you don't have." 3 days? Right. He tapped the table once. The extortion itself, the demand, the threat to the board, that's prosecutable. But the moment you involve federal authorities, this becomes a matter of public record, which means the board finds out regardless. "I know." "So your options are pay, which I'm guessing you're not going to do." "No." "Or manage this yourself before the 3 days are up." He looked at her. "Which means telling Adrian." She looked at the table. "There's a third option," Marcus said carefully. "You could separate the two issues. Address the extortion threat through Adrian's channels. He has the resources to trace this faster than any federal investigation would, without telling him the other part yet." "That's not really a third option," she said. "That's just delaying the second conversation while having the first one." "Yes," he said simply, "but sometimes that's the only order things can happen in." She got back to the Harrow Tower at 7:15, 16 minutes later than she'd said, which she knew he would notice. He was in the kitchen. He'd made dinner, actual dinner, not takeout, something that involved the good pan and multiple burners and a kitchen that smelled like garlic and wine reduction, which told her he'd been in the apartment for at least an hour working off something he wasn't saying. He cooked when he was unsettled. She'd learned that in month 1. He looked up when she's walked in, clocked the 16 minutes without saying it. She set her bag down. She unbelted her coat. She thought about the order Marcus had suggested. First conversation, then second, and decided Marcus was right, and she hated it. "I need to show you something," she said. She took out the envelope and set it on the island. He wiped his hands on a dish towel and came to look at it. He read it standing, with the same focused stillness she'd seen him apply to every threat she'd observed him receive. The absolute containment of visible reaction that was, she understood now, not indifference, but the opposite. He was more alarmed when he went still. The stillness was how you knew. He read the note. He looked at the medical record. He set both down. "When did this arrive?" "This morning." A beat. Why didn't you tell me this morning? She held his gaze. I needed to think. About what? Not angry. Worse than angry. Quiet in a way that had an edge to it. About whether I could handle it. About whether to trust me with a direct threat to your safety inside our own building. He looked at the paper again. Someone had access to this floor, Selene. Someone was in this building. I know. Then why didn't you? Because of what's in the medical record. Her voice came out level. She was almost surprised by it. He stopped. The kitchen was very quiet. She watched him look at the medical record again. She watched the moment he understood. Not the extortion, not the threat, but the date and the name and what the document actually was. She watched the comprehension move through him like weather across water, fast and total, and changing the surface of everything. He looked up at her. She didn't look away. How long have you known? He said. 10 days. Something crossed his face. She couldn't fully name it. It was too many things moving at once. 10 days, he repeated. I was waiting until I was certain. The appointment was a confirmation, not Selene. Just her name, stripped of everything except the weight of it. I know, she said. I should have told you. Yes. One word, flat and absolute. I know. You should have told me immediately. His voice was controlled, but it was costing him something. She could see the cost. Not because of the legal situation, not because of the marriage arrangement, because I deserve to know. Me. Not Adrian Vale of the syndicate, me. The distinction landed the way he meant it to, precisely. She felt the full weight of it, held it. You're right, she said. No qualification, no defensive explanation, just the acknowledgement. He turned away from the island. He walked to the window. He stood with his back to her, one hand against the glass, looking at the city, and she let him have the moment because she understood he needed it, needed to be somewhere other than in his own controlled face for 90 seconds. When he turned back, something had settled in him, not resolved, not forgiven, but settled in the way a man settles something when he understands that the present emergency requires him to be functional. The extortion first, he said. Yes. I'll have the source traced within 48 hours. We have people... He stopped. Redirected. I have a contact at Northlight Investigations. They've handled medical record breaches before. They're fast and they don't require federal involvement. Marcus Webb is already looped in on the legal exposure. Good. He came back to the island and picked up the medical record. He looked at it for a moment in a way she couldn't fully read. Then he set it back down. We talk about the other thing after the threat is neutralized. Adrian, after. Not cruel, careful. I need to handle one thing at a time. She nodded. He went back to the stove. He turned the burner down. He moved around the kitchen with careful, deliberate movements, and she watched the set of his shoulders and understood exactly how much was happening behind those shoulders that he wasn't letting into the room. She sat down at the island. It smells good, she said. A pause. It's almost ready, he said. They ate dinner. They didn't talk much. The city pressed against the windows in the dark. Well, Northlight Investigations came back in 31 hours. Their contact, a woman named Dessa Park, who wore no-nonsense blazers and spoke in organized paragraphs, arrived at the penthouse the following evening with a tablet and a folder, and delivered her findings with the directness of someone who understood that her clients paid for information, not performance. The medical record was accessed from inside the clinic's administrative system 11 days ago, Dessa said. The access point was a temporary contractor account that was opened 2 weeks prior and deactivated 4 days after the access. We traced the IP to a server routing through 3 proxies, which is professional-level cover, not amateur. She set the tablet on the island. But the account was opened using credentials belonging to a man named Curtis Farrow, currently employed as a logistics coordinator for Vale Syndicate Eastern Operations. Adrian's face didn't move. Selene watched him. Farrow is a 15-year employee, Dessa continued. Clean record inside the organization. No obvious motive. However, she pulled up a second screen. He has a brother-in-law named Peter Stoll, who works in private security. Stoll's most recent employer, based on his business filings from 8 months ago, was a consulting firm called Ashford Strategy Partners. Vivian, Adrian said. Ashford Strategy Partners is owned by a holding company that traces back to a trust that is one of several financial instruments associated with Vivian Vale's personal portfolio. Dessa said it without inflection. We can't prove she issued a direct instruction, but the chain is there. The room was very quiet. Selene looked at Adrian. He was looking at the tablet. The muscle in his jaw worked once, slowly. Barrow, he said. We have his current location if you want it. No. Flat. Forward everything to Vale Syndicate Legal and to Marcus Webb's office. Everything. The access logs, the contractor credentials, the Ashford connection. He paused. I want this in an attorney's hands before anything else moves. Dessa nodded. She packed her folder. She left. When the elevator doors closed behind her, Adrian stood at the kitchen island with both hands flat on the surface and stared at the middle distance for a long moment. She accessed medical records, Selene said carefully. That's federal. I know what it is. This is different from business. This is personal information about... I know what it is, Selene. He looked up. His eyes were very dark. She went after you, not the marriage documents, not the financial records. She went after something personal, and she used it to threaten you. He stopped. Something moved through his expression. She knew before I did. The weight of that sentence. Selene felt it land and stay. That wasn't your fault, she said. I know whose fault it was. He pushed off the counter and moved toward his office. I need to make calls. Adrian? He stopped, turned. She held his gaze. We said after. A long pause. Yes, he said. We did. He came back into the kitchen. They sat across from each other at the island, the same island where he'd left books and made coffee, and where this whole strange architecture of their shared life had accumulated. And in the quiet, she told him everything. Not the clinical version she'd given Marcus. Everything. The appointment 2 weeks before the hotel room, the specific way she'd felt when the result came back, the days of moving through the penthouse alongside him while carrying it alone, the hotel room, and what it had changed, and then the morning of the envelope and why she'd folded it into her pocket instead of handing it to him right then. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, she waited for his face, waited for whatever was coming. He reached across the island and put his hand over hers. Not a calculated gesture, nothing performed, just a hand over a hand, warm and quiet and completely steady. Okay, he said. She looked at him. Okay? We're in this. He held her gaze. Whatever it looks like, however we got here. His thumb moved once across her knuckles. Okay? She exhaled something she'd been holding for 10 days. Okay, she said. For a brief period, 11 days, she counted them later, the world contracted to something almost livable. The extortion threat dissolved once the legal documentation of Vivian's Ashford connection was filed. Whoever was carrying out her instructions went dark immediately. No second demand arrived. The danger hadn't disappeared, but it had retreated behind its own fear of exposure. Adrian stopped sleeping in the guest room. That happened gradually, over 3 nights, without either of them naming it. A slow gravitational drift that ended with Selene waking in the early morning to the weight of his arm across her ribs and the particular quality of his breathing that told her he wasn't having nightmares. He kissed her in the kitchen on a Tuesday for no reason beyond the fact that she was standing there with flour on her sleeve from an attempt at bread she'd abandoned halfway through, and he'd looked at her and laughed. Actually laughed, a real one, with his whole face involved, and then crossed the kitchen and kissed her like someone who'd been waiting a long time to do it without any strategic purpose. She kissed him back. The flour got on his shirt. Neither of them cared. She moved the rest of her books from the guest room to his shelves. He made space without being asked. Small thing. The kind of small thing that arrives without ceremony and means everything. Those 11 days were the eye of something. She would understand that later. She didn't fully understand it while she was in it. The board meeting on the 14th arrived like a weather system. Selene dressed carefully that morning, dark suit, the kind that communicated substance without trying to, and watched Adrian knot his tie in the bedroom mirror with the focused efficiency of a man preparing for a fight he intends to win. They rode the elevator down in comfortable silence. His hand found hers in the car. Vivienne was already seated when they arrived. The Vale Syndicate boardroom occupied a floor of its own in the Harrow Tower, 12 stories below the penthouse. Long table, 12 chairs, windows on 3 sides offering a panoramic view of the city that felt very deliberately designed to remind everyone present what they were gathered to discuss the fate of. 5 board members present in person, 3 remote on screens. Vivienne sat at the far end with the 2 members she'd spent 2 years cultivating, Bartholomew Cross, 71, who'd been on the board since Mara Vale's era, and Ingrid Solano, 56, who ran the syndicate's European operations and had made her position on the inheritance terms clearly known in private channels. Vivienne looked at Selene the way someone looks at a problem they're in the final stages of solving. Selene looked back. The meeting began with operational business, quarterly reports, a development proposal for the Harbor District acquisition, a legal update on 3 pending matters. 40 minutes of procedure that everyone in the room understood was preamble. Then Bartholomew Cross cleared his throat. "There's a matter of eligibility," he said, addressing the table in general and Adrian in particular, "that several members of this board feel requires formal discussion." Adrian's posture didn't change. "Go ahead." Cross looked briefly at Vivienne, who did not look at him, which answered the question of whose prepared remarks were about to emerge from Cross's mouth. "The terms of Mara Vale's bequest require a genuine marriage, contracted in good faith, for the purposes of shared life." Cross placed a hand on a folder in front of him. "There has been some concern, expressed formally to me by 2 board members and informally by a third, that the marriage between Adrian Vale and Selene Arden was contracted with commercial rather than personal intent, and may not satisfy the spirit of the bequest." "The spirit of the bequest," Adrian repeated. "The concern," Cross continued, "is that this marriage was arranged specifically to fulfill the inheritance conditions rather than arising from a genuine—" "Be careful," Adrian said quietly. Cross stopped. The room went very still. Adrian had not raised his voice, he hadn't moved. But something in his tone had changed the temperature of the air in a radius of approximately 10 feet, and everyone at the table felt it. "You're preparing to question the legitimacy of my marriage," Adrian said, still in that quiet voice. "Based on anonymous concern expressed through intermediaries, without a single piece of documented evidence in a formal board meeting that I'm going to assume someone is recording." He looked at Cross. "Think about what you'd like to say next." Cross's jaw worked. Vivienne spoke for the first time. "No one is making an accusation," she said. "Smooth, positioned. The board simply wants to ensure that the terms of the estate are met appropriately. A brief review, examining documentation, perhaps a conversation with both parties." "What you want," Selene said, "is a delay." Vivienne looked at her. "A formal review creates a deliberation period," Selene continued. Her voice was level and unhurried. "During deliberation, succession authority is held in escrow. That gives you, and whomever you've been speaking to at the federal level about the syndicate's operations, a window to act before Adrian's authority is fully secured." She let that sit for half a second. Which is why the Ashford Strategy Partners' connection to the extortion attempt against this marriage becomes particularly relevant to this board's understanding of who is actually acting in bad faith. The room went very quiet. Vivienne's expression didn't change. That was almost impressive. "I don't know what Ashford—" "We have the access logs," Selene said. "We have the contractor credentials, the IP routing, and the corporate chain from the breach back to a holding entity in your portfolio. Our attorneys have it. The documentation is currently sitting in 3 separate legal offices." She looked at Vivienne with the specific quality of calm that came from having prepared for this exact moment. "Do you want to continue talking about the spirit of the bequest?" The silence lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then Ingrid Solano said carefully, "Perhaps a recess." They won the board meeting. Not decisively. Vivienne didn't concede. She retreated, which was different. But Cross withdrew the motion for review and the room reassembled around a different agenda within 20 minutes of the recess. In the car going back to Harrow Tower, Adrian sat beside her with his hand on hers and didn't speak for several blocks. "You had all of that prepared," he said finally. "I had some of it prepared. Some of it I worked out in the room. The part about the federal window, that wasn't in what we discussed this morning." "No." "Where did that come from?" She thought about it. Her face when Cross started talking, the specific quality of her confidence. It had a timeline in it. He looked at her for a long moment. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He looked out the window. "Just, you're extraordinary. I've thought that for a long time, and I should say it more." She looked at his profile. The city slid past behind him. "Don't get sentimental," she said. "We haven't won yet." "I know." He squeezed her hand. "But we won today." She let herself have that, just for the duration of the car ride. She let herself have the warmth of it, and the steadiness of his hand, and the specific quality of the 11 days they'd built, and the feeling, unfamiliar and slightly frightening in its completeness, of being on the same side of something with someone in a way she hadn't been before. Then they got out of the car, and the concierge handed Adrian an envelope. Not paper this time. A padded envelope, no return address, priority courier. Adrian's name on the outside in typed black lettering that looked exactly like the lettering on the envelope Selene had received 9 days ago. He opened it in the lobby. Inside was a photograph. High quality, shot from a distance with a long lens. The kind of image a professional surveillance team produced. The photograph showed Selene and Marcus Webb at the table in the coffee shop on Mercer Street. In the photograph, Selene was handing Marcus the first envelope, before she'd told Adrian about it. Below the photograph, typed on a separate card, "She was protecting herself, not you. Ask her what else she's decided not to tell you." Adrian stood in the lobby for a long moment. He looked at the photograph. He looked at Selene. His face was very still. "Is there something else?" he said, in a voice she'd never heard before, quiet in a way that had distance in it now, a controlled distance that was different from the warmth of 5 minutes ago in the car, different from all 11 days of everything they'd built. "That you've decided not to tell me?" And in the lobby of the Harrow Tower, with the concierge tactfully looking away and the elevator waiting, and the city outside the glass moving through its enormous, indifferent business, Selene opened her mouth and understood that whatever she said next was going to determine whether the 11 days they'd just lived through had been the beginning of something, or, "There's nothing else," Selene said. The words came out clean, steady, the kind of steady that came not from confidence but from the decision, made in the half-second between his question and her answer, that this was not the moment, that the lobby of the Harrow Tower with a concierge 3 feet away and a photograph designed specifically to detonate something between them was exactly the moment Vivian had engineered for maximum damage, and she was not going to hand the woman that. Adrian looked at her for a long time. His face gave her nothing. "Okay," he said. He folded the photograph back into the envelope. He tucked it under his arm. He moved toward the elevator with the controlled economy of a man who had decided, as she had, that the lobby was not the place. They rode up in silence, not the comfortable silence of the car. Something different. Something with weight and edges. In the penthouse, he set the envelope on the kitchen island. The same island, always the same island. The geographical center of everything that had happened between them, and stood with his back to her for a moment, hands flat on the surface, looking at the envelope like he was deciding something about it. "The photograph is from Mercer Street," he said. "The day after the first envelope arrived." "Yes." "You met Marcus the day after and didn't tell me until that evening." "Yes." "So the note is technically accurate." He turned around. His eyes were dark and very still. "You were protecting yourself first." "I was getting legal counsel before I walked into a conversation I didn't know how to have." She held his gaze. "That's not the same thing as protecting myself instead of you. Isn't it?" "No, it isn't." Her voice stayed level. "I made a mistake in the timing. I've already said that. But the photograph and that note are designed to make you read the worst version of what I did. And I'm asking you not to." He looked at her. She looked at him. The distance between them felt different from what it had been an hour ago in the car. Not enormous, but present. A specific few degrees of temperature that hadn't been there when he'd called her extraordinary and held her hand on the leather seat. "I'm not reading the worst version," he said finally. "I'm trying to understand the actual version. Then ask me what you want to ask me." He pulled the photograph out of the envelope and set it on the island, face up. "Is there anything else you're carrying that I don't know about?" She thought about the question. The honest answer was no. There was nothing left she hadn't told him. The medical record, the timing, the appointment, the 11 days of carrying it alone. He had all of it now. The honest answer was no. No, she said. He held the photograph for another moment. Then he put it face down on the island and walked past her toward the bedroom. I need an hour, he said. She let him have it. She stood at the kitchen window and watched the city for 40 minutes and tried to locate the exact shape of what she was feeling. It wasn't fear, not precisely. It was something adjacent to fear, the specific anxiety of having built something that mattered and watching it sustain its first real structural crack, understanding that the crack wasn't fatal, but that it existed now where it hadn't before, and that you couldn't unknow that about a thing. At the hour mark exactly, she heard his footsteps. He came back into the kitchen. He looked tired in a way that the afternoon's board meeting hadn't produced. This was a different kind of tired interior, the kind that came from sitting alone with difficult feelings and working through them with whatever tools you had. He stood across the island from her. I trust you, he said. Not performatively, just a statement delivered with the same directness he applied to everything. I want you to know that. Whatever Vivian puts in front of me, whatever she's trying to make me think, he stopped. I trust you, she exhaled very slowly. But I need you to trust me back, he said, equally, not after the legal consultation, not after you've decided how to frame it, when it happens. He looked at her steadily. Can you do that? Yes, she said, and she meant it, every part of it. He came around the island and put both arms around her from behind, his chin coming to rest on the top of her head, and she felt the tension in his body. Still there, still present, a residue of everything the last hour had held. And she put her hands over his forearms, and they stood at the kitchen window watching New Carthage glitter below them in the dark. She's escalating, Selene said. I know. The board meeting, the photograph. She's compressing the timeline. She's trying to force an outcome before we can stabilize. I know. His arms tightened slightly. She's also afraid. People get sloppy when they're afraid. Vivian Vale doesn't get sloppy. Everyone gets sloppy when the alternative is losing. He paused. I want to set a trap. What kind of trap? The kind she walks into because she thinks she's the one who set it. She tilted her head back slightly to look at him. Tell me, she said. The plan was elegant in the specific way that Adrian's best strategies always were. Not complicated, but precisely calibrated, with each element performing two functions simultaneously. The core of it was simple. Feed Vivian information through a controlled channel that would make her believe Adrian was preparing to challenge the will itself on legal grounds, which would prompt her to move up her own timeline and expose whatever broader play she'd been building toward, which would in turn give them something concrete to bring to the full board rather than the accumulating circumstantial evidence they currently held. The controlled channel was a man named Franklin Reese. Reese was a senior financial analyst in the syndicate's accounting division. He had worked there for 9 years, reported directly to 2 of the board members in Vivian's orbit, and was, as Adrian explained to Selene over the next 2 days in careful, measured briefings, a deliberate double conduit. He reported to Vivian's people. He also, as of 14 months ago, reported to Adrian. He's been feeding her curated information since last spring, Adrian said. They were in his office, the actual office, not the dining table, the room with the locked door that she'd only been inside a handful of times before the last few weeks. Maps on one wall, financial architecture diagrams, a whiteboard with handwriting she'd been slowly learning to decode. She trusts what she gets through him because she thinks she recruited him. Did she? She offered. He came to me first. And you said yes. I said keep me informed of what she's asking for. He looked at the whiteboard. Most of what he passed to her was true. Low-stakes operational data that would tell her what she expected to find and keep the channel credible. He turned to look at Selene. Now I want to pass something that isn't true. Specifically, I want Vivian to believe that our legal team has found a procedural flaw in the bequest construction, a drafting error in the time frame clause, and that we're preparing to file a motion that would void the entire inheritance condition. Selene considered it. That would terrify her. Yes, because if the condition is voided, she has no claim regardless of whether the marriage holds. Correct. So she'd need to move before any filing could be formalized. Selene looked at the whiteboard. She'd need to do something drastic. And drastic, Adrian said quietly, leaves evidence. It was a good plan. She told him so. They spent 2 days refining it. They ate dinner and argued about contingencies, and she pushed back twice on elements she thought underestimated Vivian's legal sophistication. And he revised both elements without resentment, and during those 2 days, the crack from the lobby photograph slowly sealed over. Not disappeared, not forgotten, but integrated, becoming part of the structure rather than a threat to it. On the third day, Franklin Reese passed the fabricated information to his contact in Vivian's network. Then they waited. They didn't have to wait long. 48 hours after Reese made contact, Dessa Park called. "There's movement," she said. She was already on her way to the penthouse. "You need to see this in person." She arrived with 2 new folders and a look on her face that Selene had not seen from her before, something beneath the professional neutrality, something that might have been the investigator's version of concern. She opened the first folder. "Victor Vale," she said. The name arrived in the room and changed the air. Selene looked at Adrian. She'd heard the name. Victor Vale was Adrian's uncle, Mara Vale's younger brother, a man who had nominally retired from syndicate operations 6 years prior and maintained a position on the board that was largely ceremonial. She'd seen him at 2 board meetings, 70s, white-haired, the kind of old-world courtliness that felt inherited rather than learned. He'd voted with the majority on every motion she'd observed. He'd shaken her hand at the board meeting 2 weeks ago and said something pleasant about welcoming new family. "Victor Vale is the source," Dessa said. The silence was total. "The Ashford connection we traced, the holding company, the trust, it doesn't terminate with Vivian. It terminates with Victor." She set the folder open on the island. Corporate documents, financial filings, a network diagram that Selene studied with the focused attention of someone reading a map of damage already done. Vivian is the visible face. Victor is the infrastructure. He's been positioning this for 3 years, building the financial architecture to support a transfer of operational authority, maintaining legal cover through a series of charitable foundations, securing commitments from 4 board members who will vote with him when the moment arrives. 4, Adrian said, very quiet. Cross and Solano you know about. The other 2 are Harlan Park and Meredith Chu. Both have financial exposure to Victor's charitable foundation network. Both have been strategically compromised over the past 18 months. Adrian looked at the network diagram. His jaw was tight in a way that had moved past anger into something colder. "My uncle," he said. Not a question, not an expression of disbelief, just the words stated, like a man naming a wound. "There's more," Dessa said. She opened the second folder. The second folder was worse. The medical record breach had not originated with Curtis Farrow. Farrow's credentials had been used, stolen, probably without his knowledge, by a different operator. The IP routing that had led to the Ashford connection had been constructed to lead there, deliberately. A trail designed to be followed by exactly the kind of investigation Adrian's team would run, pointing to Vivian's financial structure and stopping there. Someone had known they would trace it. Someone had built a false terminus. The actual breach, Dessa said, came from inside the clinic directly. A staff member. A woman named Teresa Vance, who has worked in the clinic's records division for 4 years. She set a photograph on the island. Teresa Vance's maiden name is Vance Holloway. Her mother's second husband was a man named James Holloway, Adrian said, who served as Victor Vale's personal attorney for 17 years before his death in 2019. Dessa folded her hands. "We believe Teresa Vance has been an asset inside the clinic for at least 2 years, placed there as a contingency. Victor Vale has been building infrastructure against you for longer than the will existed." The room was very quiet. Selene looked at the photograph of Teresa Vance. Mid-30s, brown hair, a work ID clipped to her lapel. An ordinary face, the face of someone who'd been sitting inside a medical records office for 2 years, waiting for a piece of information to become useful. She thought about her medical appointment, the waiting room, the record system, the specific violation of it, not just the breach, but the premeditation, the years of preparation that had preceded the moment someone had looked at her file. She felt something cold move through her that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite rage, something between them. "The extortion demand," Selene said. The $50 million, probably never intended to be paid, Dessa said. The goal was the response, to force you to investigate, to follow the trail to Vivian, to focus your attention and your legal resources on Vivian while Victor continued to move in the background. He used her, Adrian said. She may have known she was being used. She may have agreed to it in exchange for something, a position, a financial arrangement. We don't have that level of detail yet. But the plan... Selene stopped, reorganized. The plan the whole time was never about the marriage condition. Vivian isn't the end game. No, Dessa said simply. Victor is. Adrian stood very still. She watched him process it, watched the specific quality of a man dismantling a picture he'd been operating from and rebuilding it with different architecture. She could almost track the sequence. Vivian repositioning from primary threat to instrument, Victor Vale moving from peripheral to center. Every move of the past weeks recontextualizing against a longer, deeper game than any of them had mapped. The warehouse, he said suddenly. Dessa looked at him. 3 months ago. A shipment that went wrong. We had intelligence suggesting a competitor had infiltrated our eastern distribution chain. We traced it to a mid-level operator named Cord. He looked at the network diagram. Cord worked in Victor's logistics network for 2 years before I restructured that division. We can look at that. Look at all of it. Everything that's gone wrong in the last year inside operations. I want every incident reviewed against Victor's access and connections. He looked up. How fast? 48 hours for a preliminary. Do it. Dessa left. The penthouse was very quiet. Selene watched Adrian stand at the island with the open folders in front of him, looking at the network diagram with the expression of a man who had just understood something about the ground he was standing on. Your uncle, she said softly. My grandmother trusted him. His voice was controlled, the kind of controlled that was working very hard. When she was sick, the last year, he was there. Every week, I thought... He stopped. I thought he was grieving. Maybe he was, Selene said, and doing this at the same time. He looked at her. People contain both, she said. Something moved through his face. Not absolution. He wasn't built for absolution. Not right now. But acknowledgement. He picked up the network diagram and looked at it. He was in the building the week the security cameras went down, Adrian said. 2 months ago. We attributed it to a system malfunction. He set the paper down. He had access to the garage, the envelope on your car. Adrian! He sat across from us at the board meeting and shook your hand. His jaw worked. He knew about the pregnancy before I did. He knew before you told me. He was at that table watching us, and he knew. She let him sit with that, because there was nothing to say to it that would reduce what it was. Victor Vale had spent years building a siege. He'd placed an asset inside a medical facility as a contingency. He'd stolen a piece of the most private information in Selene's life and turned it into a weapon and pointed it at his nephew's marriage. And he'd done all of it from behind the face of a grieving brother at a funeral. That was the actual shape of the enemy. Not Vivian, with her ambition and her boardroom maneuvering and her well-tailored contempt. Victor, patient, architectural, family. We have to move first, Selene said. I know. If he finds out we know, he won't. Adrian's voice had changed. The rawness from a moment ago was gone, packed back down somewhere functional, replaced by the other version, the version the boardroom feared, the version that thought 3 moves ahead before speaking. He's expecting us to be focused on Vivian. He's expecting the fabricated legal motion to push her into action, which he's been planning to let her absorb. She takes the fall for whatever move she makes. He positions himself as a stabilizing force, offering the board a path forward. He looked at the whiteboard. He's the fire marshal in an arson, he said himself. So we let Vivian make her move, Selene said slowly, and we have everything we need positioned before she does. He picked up his phone. I need to call someone. Who? Someone I should have called a long time ago. He walked to the window. She heard him dial, heard the line pick up, heard him say a name she didn't recognize into the phone in a tone that was quiet and very deliberate, and left no room for the person on the other end to mistake what was being asked. She looked at the network diagram. She looked at Teresa Vance's photograph. She thought about the waiting room at the clinic and the records office just down the hall, and a woman with an ordinary face who had been sitting there for 2 years. Her phone buzzed. Marcus Webb. She picked up. "I need you to see something," Marcus said. No preamble. "I'm sending a file to your secure email. Read it before you do anything else today." "What is it?" "It's a deposition from 18 months ago. Civil matter, financial dispute, case that was quietly settled before it went anywhere." A pause. The deponent is a woman who worked as a legal assistant in Victor Vale's personal offices from 2017 to 2021. Something tightened in Selene's chest. "She describes witnessing the preparation of documents," Marcus said. "Financial instruments. Specifically, instruments designed to allow the rapid transfer of operational authority within a private syndicate structure, contingent on the death or incapacitation of the primary heir." The room felt very still. "Marcus, the documents she describes," he said quietly, "predate Mara Vale's diagnosis by 14 months. She stopped breathing for a moment. 14 months before Mara's diagnosis. Before the will was changed, before any of this had a visible shape. Victor hadn't been responding to his sister's death. He'd been building toward it. The case settled because the opposing counsel received a significant financial offer 2 days before depositions were completed," Marcus said. "The deponent, her name is Ana Ruiz, signed an NDA. The deposition itself was sealed." Another pause. "The seal was lifted 6 weeks ago as part of an unrelated civil discovery process. I found it yesterday." "Can you reach Ana Ruiz?" "I've already tried. She's in New Carthage. She agreed to a call." "When?" "Tonight, 9 o'clock. I'll be there." She ended the call. Across the room, Adrian was still on his phone at the window, speaking in the low, controlled voice of a man arranging something that required precision. She watched his shoulders, the way he held the phone, the way his free hand rested against the glass. She looked at Marcus's email on her screen. She thought about the word predate, 14 months before the diagnosis, which meant the entire architecture, the will, the marriage condition, the 6-month deadline, Vivian, Reese, Teresa Vance in the records office, the envelope on her car, the photograph in the lobby, all of it, had been constructed around a foundation that Victor Vale had been building years before any of them understood there was a building going up. They had not been fighting a response to circumstance. They had been living inside someone else's design. Adrian ended his call. He turned from the window. She looked at him. "I need to tell you something," she said. His eyes sharpened. She told him about Marcus's call, about Ana Ruiz, about the deposition and the sealed documents and the phrase that had restructured everything, 14 months before the diagnosis. He listened without moving. When she finished, the silence lasted long enough that she could hear the building's ventilation, the distant murmur of the city, the particular quality of quiet that arrived when a person was reconstructing something fundamental. "He built this around her death," Adrian said. "Yes." "He was planning before she was sick." "Yes." Something happened in his face that she didn't have a word for. Not grief exactly. Grief was too simple. Something that involved grief and rage and the specific devastation of understanding that a person you shared blood with had spent years looking at your life as a problem to be solved. "The trap," he said. His voice had gone flat. "Feeding Vivian the false information about the legal motion. Still useful. She moves, we capture what she does. Victor's plan to use her as cover gets exposed." She paused. "But we also need Ana Ruiz." "The meeting tonight." "Yes." He crossed the room. He picked up the network diagram. He looked at it for a long moment. This map of what had been done to them, the years of it, the patient construction of their undoing laid out in boxes and lines on a single sheet. Then he set it down carefully. "I need you to go to that meeting," he said. "I know. Take Marcus. Take 2 of our people outside. Not inside. I don't want to frighten her. I know how to do this." He looked at her. "I know you do." Something in his voice, not apology, not quite, but adjacent to it. "I know." "What are you going to do?" He looked at the whiteboard, at the names on it, at the lines connecting them. "I'm going to the warehouse," he said. She went still. "Which warehouse?" "The harbor facility, the one from 3 months ago. If Cord was connected to Victor, if that's where the Eastern Chain Compromise started, there may be documentation we didn't find because we weren't looking in the right direction. He pulled out his phone again. I need 2 of our people and 2 hours. Adrian. She looked at him. If Victor has any indication that we know, he doesn't. But if he does, then I'd rather be at the warehouse than here. His eyes met hers. The penthouse is the obvious place to move on. The warehouse is off his map. She wanted to argue. She looked at the logic of it and found it sound and hated that it was sound. Call me when you're there, she said, and when you're coming back. I will. He came to her. He cupped her face in both hands and kissed her once, firmly, the way you kiss someone when you're leaving and you want them to know you intend to return. Then he picked up his jacket and walked to the elevator. She stood in the kitchen and watched the doors close. She looked at the network diagram. She looked at Teresa Vance's photograph. She thought about Ana Ruiz and a sealed deposition and 14 months of Victor Vale's patience. She picked up her phone and called Marcus. I'll be there at 9, she said. Start without a summary. I want to hear everything she says in her own words. Understood, Marcus said. Selene. A brief pause. The woman is scared. She's been scared for 4 years, whatever she tells us tonight. I know, Selene said. She ended the call. She checked the time, 6:47, 2 hours and 13 minutes. She began getting ready. She was reaching for her coat when her phone rang again. Adrian's number. She picked up immediately. We're at the warehouse, he said. His voice was wrong, the same quality as the night he'd called her at 2 a.m. Something displaced in it, something stripped. What is it? A pause. There's someone here, he said. Already here, Selene. In the warehouse. Another pause, and she could hear his breathing and something underneath it. Voices, maybe, or the echoing quality of a large empty space suddenly not empty. There's someone who wasn't supposed to... The line cut. Dead silence. She stood in the penthouse with the phone pressed to her ear and the city glowing outside the windows, and the coat half on her shoulder and the network diagram on the island, and his voice still echoing in her memory. Already here. And she called back immediately. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3, 4, and it went to voicemail. And she called again. And again it went to voicemail, and on the 3rd attempt, the line didn't even ring. It went directly to a recording that told her the number was temporarily. The line was dead. Selene called back 4 times in 40 seconds. Each time the same recording. Each time the same wall of silence where his voice should have been. She stood in the middle of the penthouse with her coat half on and her heart doing something violent against her sternum, and she made herself stop. Made herself breathe. Made herself think instead of react, because reacting right now meant driving to a harbor warehouse without a plan, and that was how people died, and she was not going to be the reason anyone died tonight. She called Dessa Park. Adrian's gone dark at the harbor facility, she said. The moment Dessa picked up. No preamble. He went with 2 people, approximately 40 minutes ago. His line is dead. Not voicemail, dead, like the phone's been disabled or destroyed. I need you to find out if your contacts at Harbor Security have any movement logged at that facility in the last 2 hours. On it, Dessa said immediately. Stay on. Selene put the call on speaker and moved to Adrian's office. She unlocked it with the code he'd given her 3 weeks ago, a gesture she'd understood to be significant and hadn't said anything about, and went to the second drawer on the left side of his desk. She'd seen him open it twice. She pulled it now. Inside 2 phones, a folded document that looked like a contact sheet, a handgun she knew was licensed, which she was not going to touch, and a small hard drive with a strip of adhesive tape on it labeled in his handwriting, Emergency Protocol, Full Board. She took the contact sheet. She took the hard drive. Selene, Dessa's voice from the phone on the desk. Harbor Security logged 2 private vehicles entering the facility at 7:12. No exit logged after entry. 2 vehicles. Adrian had taken 2 people. That was 1 vehicle. Who owns the second vehicle? Selene said. A pause while Dessa worked. The registration traces to a shell company. Another pause, shorter. The shell company is one of 6 I have on a watch list associated with Victor Vale's network. The cold that moved through Selene was very specific. It wasn't surprise. She'd known the moment Adrian's line died that this was what it was. But knowing something and having it confirmed were different physical experiences, and this one landed in her chest like something dropped from a height. How many people? She said. I can't get a head count from the logs, just vehicle entry. I need eyes on that building. I can have someone there in 20 minutes. Do it. She picked up the phone and took it off speaker and pressed it to her ear. Dessa, whatever you find, call me directly. Don't route it through anyone in the syndicate. No one. Understood. She ended the call. She stood in the office for exactly 3 seconds. Then she called Marcus. Cancel Ana Ruiz, she said. What's happened? Adrian's at the harbor facility and he's gone dark. Victor's people were there first. She was already moving back through the penthouse. I need you to do something for me right now. The hard drive from Adrian's emergency protocol. I need to know where it transmits to and whether I can activate it without him. A pause. Selene, that kind of transmit protocol on a board-level document usually requires… Marcus, I don't have time for usually. She picked up the hard drive from the island where she'd set it, turned it over in her hand. Figure it out and call me back in 10 minutes. She hung up. She looked at the coat on her shoulders, fully on now, without remembering putting it on. She looked at the network diagram still open on the island, at Teresa Vance's photograph, at the hard drive in her hand. She looked at the window, at the city. Somewhere in the black geography below her, in a harbor facility that smelled of oil and salt water, Adrian Vale was either being held or hurt or… She stopped that thought, cut it clean. She picked up her keys. She didn't go to the harbor facility. That was the hardest decision she made all night, and she made it in the elevator going down, standing very still with the hard drive in her coat pocket and her hands completely steady in a way that felt almost physiological. The body choosing function over feeling because the alternative was useless. Going to the warehouse was what they wanted. If she walked in there without leverage, without something in her hands that changed the equation, she was just one more variable for Victor to manage. She would be used. She understood this with cold clarity. She needed the leverage first. She called Dessa from the car. The facility has a secondary access point, Dessa said. Her contact was already on approach. Northeast corner, loading dock, the lock was cut. Recently, within the last few hours. 3 to 5 individuals estimated inside based on thermal from the exterior. Adrian? One person separated from the others. Different area of the building. Ground floor, south end. Alive. Separated, which meant contained, which meant Victor wanted him functional for some purpose. If he'd wanted him simply gone, the warehouse would have been cleaner than this. Don't go in, Selene said. Hold position and watch entry points. My person is already external. They won't move without your word. Good. Marcus called back at the 9-minute mark. The protocol on the hard drive is a board-level emergency transmit, he said. It's designed to be activated by either Adrian or his designated proxy. You were listed as designated proxy 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago. 2 weeks before the courthouse wedding. She processed this without stopping. How do I activate it? Marcus walked her through it. 30 seconds of instruction. A 12-digit sequence on the drive's interface, a confirmation code sent to her phone, and the drive would transmit its content simultaneously to the full Veil board, to 3 secure legal repositories, and to the Federal Financial Crimes Division that had been building a file on the syndicate's structural operations for 2 years. She held the drive and looked at the road. If I activate this, she said, what happens to the syndicate? Marcus was quiet for a moment. The legitimate operations survive. The criminal architecture, he paused. Adrian built this to be activated. He put you on the proxy list. He knew what it would do. She thought about the whiteboard, the names on it, the lines. She thought about what Adrian had said 11 days ago about what he wanted to build, what his future children wouldn't inherit with blood on their hands. Okay, she said. Selene, whatever you're planning, I need the leverage, she said. I need Victor to know I have it before I walk into that building. A very long pause. You're going to the warehouse, Marcus said. Yes. That is an exceptionally dangerous… I know what it is. She turned onto the harbor access road. She could see the facility now. A long, dark shape against the water. The kind of building that existed specifically to be unnoticed, enormous and lightless, and surrounded by the kind of industrial vacancy that provided privacy to whatever happened inside it. Get Ana Ruiz's deposition to the same 3 legal repositories. Tonight. Now. It's already… Now, Marcus. Done, he said. She drove to within 2 blocks of the facility and parked. She sat in the car for a moment. She took the hard drive out of her pocket. She thought about a courthouse wedding, and a 2-second kiss and coffee made the right temperature on a kitchen island, and a man who had looked at her 11 days ago and said, "We're in this with the specific conviction of someone who had decided completely, without reservation, to mean it." She got out of the car. The northeast loading dock entrance was exactly where Dessa's contact had placed it. The cut lock was still hanging in the hasp. Recent, clean, the kind of cut that professional equipment made. Selene pushed the door open with one hand, slowly, and stood in the gap for 2 seconds listening before she moved through. Inside, the smell of rust and standing water and engine oil and cold salt air off the harbor. The facility was a large single-floor space, mostly open, with a series of industrial shelving units running parallel down the center that broke the sight lines and created corridors of shadow between them. Overhead, old industrial lighting hung dead on their cables. The only light was ambient, the diffused glow of the harbor lights coming through high windows, cold and gray and giving everything a quality of charcoal sketch. She moved along the east wall, slowly, her sneakers on the concrete floor, her breathing even. She found the first of Victor's people 20 feet in. He was standing at the end of a shelving corridor, back to her, arms crossed, watching the south end of the building. Security, posture, professional. She stopped before he could have heard her and held herself very still against the wall and took inventory. 6 feet, wide shoulders, the specific way he was standing that said ex-military or private contractor. She didn't have a weapon. She had a hard drive and a phone and the knowledge that if she made a sound, this whole situation became something she couldn't control. She went back to the east wall and found the next corridor, and stopped. Victor Vale was standing 15 feet away. He was facing away from her, toward the south end of the building, his hands clasped behind his back in the posture she'd seen at board meetings. Composed, patient, the stance of a man accustomed to waiting for things he'd already arranged. He was wearing a dark overcoat. His white hair was visible in the harbor light gray. Beside him, 2 men, both facing outward, and on the south wall, she could see it now, could see him now. Adrian. He was on his feet, which mattered, which she registered with a relief so physical it was almost dizzying. He was standing with his back to the concrete wall, and there were 2 men within arm's reach of him, and his hands were bound in front of him with flex cuff, and there was blood on his face, a cut above his left eye, the kind that came from a blow rather than a fall. But he was standing, and he was upright, and his eyes were open, and when she saw them, they were doing the specific thing his eyes did when he was at maximum containment, absolutely still, processing, waiting for the variable that changed the calculation. She was the variable. She stepped out of the shadow. Victor. Her voice in the empty building was very loud. Every head turned. Victor Vale turned slowly, the way a man turned when he had prepared himself for this exact possibility, which told her he'd known she was coming and had let her arrive. That was information. She filed it. He looked at her. His face was exactly as it had been at the board meeting, composed, courtly, the face of a man who had learned to keep his actual architecture invisible. "Selene," he said. Pleasant, almost warm. "I wondered how long you'd wait in the car." He'd known she was outside. He'd had someone watching. She adjusted. "Let him go," she said. "That seems premature." He tilted his head slightly. "You've just arrived." She took the hard drive out of her coat pocket. She held it up. Something moved in Victor's eyes. Not surprise. He was past surprise, but a specific recalibration, a rapid processing of what the object meant and what it implied about what she'd done before she arrived. "Emergency protocol," she said. "Adrian put me on the proxy authorization 6 weeks ago. I need a 12-digit code and a confirmation from my phone." She held the drive steady. Her hand did not shake. "I've already arranged for Ana Ruiz's deposition to be transmitted to 3 legal repositories. That's done. That's already out of the building and into the world." Victor looked at the drive for a long moment. "You understand," he said carefully, "that activating that transmit will expose every operational element of the syndicate, including the legitimate, I understand what it does. Adrian would not want... Adrian is standing against a wall with a cut on his face because of choices you made," she said. The evenness in her voice cost her something. She paid it. Don't tell me what Adrian would want. A pause. Victor looked at her with the expression of a man revising his assessment of a variable he'd underestimated. You're pregnant, he said. The word in the room, the specific ugliness of him saying it, the use of it, the surgical deployment of it as a fact he possessed, and she didn't know he knew she knew he knew. She held his gaze. Yes, she said. Then you're not going to activate that drive. His voice was gentle. The gentleness was the worst part. Because you understand that what it triggers, the federal involvement, the operational collapse, the 18 months of proceedings that follow, is not an environment you want to raise a child in. She said nothing. What I'm offering, Victor said, is clean. Adrian steps aside. A structured transfer of authority, voluntary, documented, legally sound. He keeps the legitimate holdings. He keeps the residential properties. He keeps his life exactly as he wants to live it, which frankly, from what I've observed, has very little to do with running the syndicate, and a great deal to do with standing in that kitchen making coffee for you. She heard Adrian make a sound. Not a word. A short, involuntary sound that came from somewhere past his controlled composure. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Victor. The syndicate continues, Victor said, in capable hands. Vivian takes the visible position. She's useful. She's motivated. She'll make an effective face. I take operational authority. The criminal elements you're both so opposed to. A slight pause. Honestly, Selene, those generate less than 8% of total revenue. Their primary value is leverage, not income. I'd restructure within 2 years regardless. You accessed my medical records, she said. Something shifted in his face. You placed a woman in that clinic 2 years ago, she said, waiting, in case something useful came up. You used my pregnancy as a weapon against my husband before he knew it existed. She paused. And you're talking to me about what's clean. A silence. That was a decision don't. One word, flat. Don't qualify it. His composure held, but there was something behind it. She could see it now, the faint outline of a man who had built so much architecture around himself that he'd stopped examining what the architecture was for. Release him, she said again. We walk out of here. We go back to the Harrow Tower and we sit down with lawyers tomorrow and we discuss every option on the table like rational people. She held up the drive. Or I put in the code right now and we all find out together what the next 18 months look like. Victor looked at the drive. He looked at her. He looked at Adrian. At whatever was in Adrian's face, some quality she couldn't see from this angle. Something moved through the composed, old-world courtesy of Victor Vale's expression. Something that might have been, in a different man, admiration. You'd actually do it, he said. Not a question. Yes. You'd burn your own life down. I'd burn whatever needs burning, she said, to get my husband out of this building. The word husband in her mouth felt like the truest thing she'd said all night. Not contractual, not arrangement, just the word, clean and absolute, meaning exactly what it said. Silence. Victor turned to the two men flanking Adrian. Cut him loose, he said. Neither man moved immediately. They looked at Victor with the specific hesitation of men receiving an unexpected instruction from the person who'd issued all the previous ones. I said cut him loose. One of them produced a blade. The flex cuff fell. Adrian straightened and she watched him work his wrists apart, and his eyes came across the warehouse and found hers. And in his face was something she would think about for the rest of her life. The specific quality of a man who had watched someone choose him, completely, without flinching, at the cost of everything. He crossed the floor toward her. She watched him come. He was 10 feet away when Vivian stepped out of the darkness on the far end of the building. Selene had not seen her, had not heard her, had built her entire calculation on a room that contained Victor and his people and Adrian, and had not accounted for the door on the north end that she hadn't checked, hadn't seen, hadn't known was there. Vivian Vale was wearing black tactical clothing that looked slightly too perfect, like a costume chosen to communicate a specific intention. Her hair was back. In her right hand was what appeared to be a remote detonator, a flat rectangular device with a single covered switch. And in her left was a phone displaying a live video feed. She looked at Selene with the expression of someone who had been waiting for a very specific moment and had just arrived at it. The drive, Vivian said, is irrelevant. Her voice was composed in a way that was completely different from Victor's composure. His had been architecture. Hers was adrenaline pressed down hard and held there by will. We have 22 kilograms of accelerant positioned through this building. Triggers are remote. She showed the detonator. The phone has a backup dead man circuit. If the phone loses signal, the triggers activate. She looked at the phone. You have a 12-digit code and a confirmation on your phone, Selene. Use it, and the signal disruption activates the circuit. Trust scoops. The room was completely silent. Selene looked at the detonator. She looked at Adrian, who had stopped walking toward her and was now very still, 10 feet away, reading the room with the specific quality of attention of a man calculating every variable simultaneously. She looked at Victor, whose composure had fractured. Vivienne, Victor said carefully, this is not. You were going to give it to her. Vivienne looked at her uncle with an expression that held something ancient in it. Years of watching, years of being positioned as the visible face of something she didn't fully control. You were going to stand there and give it to her because she held up a hard drive and looked at you and said the right words. She looked back at Selene. He does that. He finds the thing that matters to you and he uses it to manage you. And then when it's convenient, he trades you away. I've watched him do it for 15 years. Something passed between Vivienne and Victor that Selene couldn't fully read. Some layered history. Some grievance that was older than any of this. The detonator is real, Vivienne said to Selene. I need you to understand that. I am not bluffing and I am not negotiating. She looked at Adrian. You have one choice. Sign documents. Tonight. Full transfer of succession authority. Your attorney's against mine right here in this building, and when it's done, everyone walks out. Adrian looked at Vivienne. He looked at Selene. He looked at the detonator. His jaw was tight. The blood from the cut above his eye had dried in a thin, dark line down his temple. His hands were completely steady at his sides. He had the look of a man who had made a specific peace with a specific decision and was in the process of communicating that peace to everyone in the room through the quality of his stillness. There are no documents, he said. Quiet. Absolute. I'm not signing anything. Vivienne's finger moved to the covered switch. Adrian, Selene said. There are no documents, he said again, looking directly at Vivienne. Because whatever you do to us in this building, the transmit from that drive is going to the board and to the federal investigators. And you will spend the rest of your life explaining tonight to people who are very good at asking questions. He paused. You've already lost. You just haven't accepted it yet. Vivienne's face changed, not collapse. Something more dangerous than collapse. The expression of a person who has understood that the situation has moved beyond what they planned for and who has decided that the original plan is no longer the point. Her thumb moved the cover off the switch. Then nobody, she started. The facility's overhead lights came on, all of them, simultaneously. The entire building flooded with light so sudden and total that everyone in it flinched. Victor, Vivienne, the security people, Selene herself, everyone except Adrian, who had closed his eyes a half second before the lights triggered, which meant he had known they were coming. In the blinding white aftermath of that half second, a door on the south wall opened, and 4 people in tactical gear with federal law enforcement markings came through it, and a second team came through the northeast loading dock behind Selene, and a third came through the north door 6 feet from where Vivienne was standing, and someone was already shouting instructions in the clipped, efficient cadence of trained personnel executing a prepared sequence. And Vivienne's phone was on the ground, knocked from her hand by someone moving faster than she'd tracked, and the detonator was being pried from fingers that had gone rigid with something that wasn't quite shock, not quite yet, still trying to be resolved even as the moment dissolved around it. Selene stood in the middle of all of it and breathed, in, out. The overhead lights were very bright. Adrian was beside her. She didn't know when he'd crossed the 10 feet. He was just there, suddenly, his hand on her arm, his voice low and close to her ear. Are you hurt? No. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. Are you? I'm fine. His hand moved from her arm to the back of her neck briefly, a grip that was more communication than restraint, and she felt his pulse in his palm, fast, not as controlled as his face was. I'm fine. Across the warehouse, Vivienne was being restrained. She was not going quietly. Selene could hear her voice, could hear the specific quality of it. Anger compressed past its own walls into something more raw and less controlled. And beside her, Victor Vale stood with his hands raised and his composure entirely gone, and the expression of a man watching years of architecture come apart in under 4 minutes. A federal officer with a badge on a lanyard approached Selene. "Ms. Arden Vale?" she said. "Yes. We'll need your statement. You can give it on site, or—" "Here is fine," Selene said. She looked at Adrian. He looked at her. There was blood drying on his face and flour on neither of their sleeves this time, and the building smelled of rust and salt, and they were standing in the industrial light of a harbor facility, surrounded by federal personnel, and it was the least romantic setting she could have imagined. And she felt, looking at him, something so complete and specific that she didn't have a word for it, only the physical fact of it in her chest, solid and warm and entirely unwilling to be anything other than what it was. "You knew," she said quietly. "The lights. The federal team." "The call I made from the penthouse," he said. 18 months ago, I had a conversation with someone in the Financial Crimes Division. A preliminary conversation about what cooperation might look like, hypothetically, if I decided to— He stopped. "I called in a very significant favor tonight. You were already planning to dismantle it." "I was already planning to dismantle it," he confirmed. She looked at him. "You could have told me," she said. "I know." His jaw moved. He stopped again. She watched him locate the honest version. "I was afraid that if I told you what I was working toward, you'd think the marriage was part of it. Another arrangement. Another strategy." He held her gaze. "I needed you to know that what I feel for you has nothing to do with what I was building toward. That you weren't—" "I know," she said. "I know that. I needed you to know it before I—" "Adrian." She put her hand against his face, careful of the cut. "I know." He covered her hand with his. Around them, the warehouse continued its ordered dismantling. Personnel moving, documentation being gathered, the long, formal machinery of consequences beginning its work. Victor Vale was being escorted toward the south door. Vivian's voice had gone quiet. The federal officer was waiting patiently. Selene lowered her hand. "Okay," she said to the officer. "Let's start from the beginning." Began to talk. Adrian stood beside her the whole time, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his arm against hers. And outside the harbor facility, the night moved through its final hours toward something that was not yet visible but was already, irrevocably. The federal proceedings lasted 11 months. Not the warehouse night itself. That resolved cleanly, in the specific way that operations resolve when they've been prepared properly. When the documentation is in place and the cooperation agreement is signed and the people doing the arresting have everything they need before the handcuffs come out. That night resolved in under 4 hours. Victor Vale was in federal custody before midnight. Vivian was processed at the same facility, separated from her uncle by 2 holding rooms and whatever remained of the alliance between them, which, from what Selene observed in the brief window before the federal team closed the building to non-essential personnel, was not much. What lasted 11 months was everything that came after. The hearings, the depositions, the document reviews, the dismantling of the Vale Syndicate's criminal architecture piece by piece, each piece requiring its own paperwork, its own testimony, its own careful separation from the legitimate holdings that Adrian had spent 2 years quietly positioning for survival. His cooperation agreement gave him specific protections. It did not give him ease. There is no version of voluntarily handing the government a map of everything you've built that feels like anything other than what it is. An accounting, paid in full, with interest. Selene sat beside him through most of it. Not all of it was her place to be present for. Some of it was his alone to carry. The sessions with federal attorneys, the formal testimony, the closed-door meetings with investigators who had been building their file for 2 years and now had everything they needed and still wanted more, always more, the machinery of prosecution being what it is. She learned to read which days required her presence and which required her to be at the penthouse when he came home, with dinner made or a book on the island and the particular quality of available silence that meant she was there without requiring anything from him. He learned to come home instead of staying at the office until the building went dark. That was not a small thing. She understood it was not a small thing. Sharper. Ana Ruiz gave her deposition a second time, formally, in a federal proceeding 7 weeks after the warehouse. She was a small woman, 50s, with the specific quality of someone who had been carrying a weight for years and had developed a kind of functional relationship with it. Not at peace with it, not free of it, but accustomed. She gave her testimony in a clear and methodical voice and did not look at Victor Vale, who was present through his attorney's live feed, at any point during the 2 hours. Selene was in the room. Afterward, in the corridor outside, Ana Ruiz stopped and looked at her directly. "I should have come forward earlier," she said. No preamble, no context, just the sentence, delivered like something she'd been holding in her mouth for a long time and had decided to finally set down. "You came forward," Selene said. "That's what matters now." Ana Ruiz looked at her for a moment with an expression that was too complicated to name. Then she nodded once and walked away down the corridor, and Selene watched her go and thought about the specific weight of years, how they accumulated in a person's body, how they showed in the way someone walked, how the difference between a choice made too late and a choice made in time was sometimes just the moment when the fear of staying silent finally exceeded the fear of speaking. Thought. Teresa Vance pled guilty to a federal privacy violation charge in the 4th month. Her sentencing hearing lasted 40 minutes. Selene attended the first 10 minutes and then left, not because she couldn't sit through it, but because sitting through it had begun to feel like a form of consumption, feeding on the spectacle of consequence rather than simply letting consequence be what it was. She told Adrian about it that evening. He listened, sitting across from her at the kitchen island, hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. "Was it enough?" he asked. She thought about the question honestly. "I don't know yet. Ask me in a year." He looked at the table. "What Victor did to her," he said. "Using her, positioning her like an asset, like a piece on a board. She made choices," Selene said. "She made them for years. That's also true. Both things are true." "Yes." She held his gaze. "Both things are always true." He turned the cold mug in his hands. "I keep looking for the moment it went wrong with him," he said. "The specific year or the specific decision. I keep trying to find the point before it got to the warehouse. And I can't find it." He set the mug down. "I think maybe there wasn't a specific moment. I think maybe he always wanted the thing he tried to take, and the want just got larger over time until it was the only thing left." She thought about Vivian in the warehouse, the specific quality of her voice when she'd talked about Victor. He finds the thing that matters to you and he uses it to manage you. A grievance that was real, embedded inside a betrayal that was also real, both things. "What happens to her?" Selene asked. "Vivian." She paused. "After the proceedings." Adrian was quiet for a moment. Her cooperation was substantial. She gave testimony on Victor's financial architecture that will be the core of the federal case. Her attorneys have been aggressive. He looked at the table. "Reduced charges, probably a period of supervised release. She loses the board position. The financial holdings she built through Ashford are subject to recovery proceedings. But she walks." "Probably?" Selene absorbed this. "She told me something true in that warehouse," she said. "About Victor. About what he does to people." "I know." "She was used." "She also chose to use a detonator," he said. "Not angry, just the fact of it, stated plainly. Both things are true." She almost smiled at having her own observation returned to her. "Yes," she said. "They are." That Curtis Farrow, whose credentials had been stolen to access the clinic records, who had been an instrument without his knowledge, was cleared in the 5th month. Adrian met with him personally. Selene didn't ask what was said in the meeting. She knew Adrian well enough by then to understand that some accounting was done face-to-face without an audience, and that what came out of it was between the two men. Farrow stayed with the syndicate's restructured operations. That told her enough. Boo? The Vale family estate had been Victor's primary residence for the last 6 years, maintained under a property agreement that Adrian's attorneys began unwinding in the 7th month. The building itself, a 19th century brick structure on 4 acres at the northern edge of New Carthage, the kind of house that had absorbed generations of the specific damage that powerful families did to each other inside their walls, went through a legal review that took 3 months to complete. When it came back to Adrian, he stood in the entrance hall for a long time without speaking. Selene stood beside him. The house smelled of absence, the specific quality of a space that had been lived in for generations and then abruptly emptied. The furniture was still in place, Victor's reading chair, his books still on the shelves, a framed photograph on the mantel that showed him and Mara Vale, somewhere in their 30s, laughing at something outside the frame's edge. Adrian looked at the photograph for a long time. "Did she know?" Selene asked, quietly. "I've thought about that every day for 7 months." He looked at his grandmother's face in the photograph, the specific laugh of her, caught in a moment before she became the woman who ruled half the eastern seaboard with fear and precision. "I don't think she did. I think she trusted him the way you trust someone who's been beside you for 40 years, which means she stopped looking at him clearly a long time ago." "The will," Selene said. "The marriage condition. I think she was trying to protect me from Vivian. That was the threat she could see." He paused. "She couldn't see Victor because she'd stopped looking. She couldn't have known what she built around you." "No." He looked at the photograph for another moment. Then he turned away from it. "I want to change everything in this room." "Okay." "Not immediately, but I don't want to walk through a door and see his chair." "Then we change it." He looked at her. "You'd live here?" She looked around the entrance hall. High ceilings, old brick, a staircase that curved upward with the specific architecture of a house built to contain large things, large families, large histories, large silences. Outside the windows, 4 acres of overgrown grounds that had gone slightly wild in the months of legal proceedings. "It needs work," she said. "Significant work. I like projects." Something moved through his face. The almost smile, and then more than the almost smile, the real one, the full one, the one she'd only started seeing in the last several months with any regularity, the one that changed his whole face and made him look like a different version of himself. An older version, younger somehow, at the same time. "I'll have the chair removed this week," he said. "Start with the chair," she agreed. Well, the criminal operations were formally dissolved in the 8th month. Not all at once. The dismantling was surgical, conducted with the federal investigators' oversight and Adrian's cooperation and the quiet professionalism of attorneys who understood they were handling something that had to be done right, because doing it wrong would pull the legitimate holdings down with it. The Harbor District property, the distribution infrastructure, the shell companies and the shadow accounts, and the leverage mechanisms that had been the syndicate's actual currency for 4 decades, gone. What remained was substantial. The financial institutions, restructured under clean ownership, the import logistics operation, which had always been more legitimate than its shadow counterpart, the real estate holdings, the investment portfolio that Selene had been managing elements of for 3 years and now oversaw in a formal capacity, which was a professional arrangement that required exactly one conversation between her and Adrian to establish. "I need you to treat me like a client," she said. "You're my wife. In the office, treat me like a client. Our personal relationship is not a professional asset, and I won't have anyone on the board thinking it is." He'd looked at her with the expression he got when she said something that he would have said himself, and was slightly irritated she'd gotten there first. "Agreed," he said. "Good. You're going to be extremely difficult to work with. You've known that for 11 years. 13, he said. "I've known it for 13 years. The board reconstituted in the 9th month. Cross and Solano resigned ahead of the formal proceedings against them. Reduced to civil liability, their cooperation on the federal case giving them enough clearance to avoid criminal exposure but not enough to retain their positions. Harlan Park and Meredith Chu were removed by a board vote that was not close. The 4 seats were filled by people Adrian had been quietly identifying for 2 years. 2 from outside the syndicate's traditional networks. 1, an attorney with a federal background. 1, a financial architect who had been working in legitimate institutional investment and who came in with the specific quality of someone who had been waiting to be asked. The new board met for the first time in the restructured Vale Holdings boardroom in the 10th month. Selene sat at the table, not as a spouse in attendance, as a formal member, voted in by a board that had reviewed her credentials and her 3 years of documented work inside the organization's financial structures, and her performance under 11 months of federal proceedings that would have dismantled people with less fundamental steadiness. She sat down in the chair. She looked at the new configuration of faces around the table. She thought about a courthouse 4 days after a desperate phone call, fluorescent lighting, a 2-second kiss, the feeling of signing her name to something she'd told herself was purely contractual. She thought about a hotel room doorway and a man's voice stripped of everything it usually hid behind. She put her pen on the table and opened the first document. Aurora Vale was born on the 3rd of December during the first real snowfall of the year. It came early. The snow, not Aurora, though Aurora also came slightly early, which her obstetrician described as impatient, and which Selene privately thought was entirely appropriate given the circumstances of her conception and the 11 months that had surrounded her gestation. The snow started around 4 in the morning, and by the time they were in the car heading to the hospital, the city was silent and white and transformed into a version of itself that looked almost gentle. The hard edges of New Carthage softened under 3 inches of quiet accumulation. Adrian drove. He drove with both hands on the wheel and a focused stillness that she recognized as his crisis mode, the same containment he brought to warehouse operations and board confrontations, applied to the entirely different crisis of getting his wife to a hospital in a snowstorm. And somewhere around the 2nd mile, she started laughing and couldn't fully stop. "What?" he said. "Your face," she managed. "My face is fine. You look like you're diffusing something." "I am diffusing something. The something is traffic." "There is no traffic. It's 4 in the morning and it's snowing and the city is empty." "There could be traffic." She laughed again, through a contraction that was not particularly funny, and he reached across and put his hand briefly over hers on the armrest, and she felt his pulse in his palm, fast, faster than his face was showing, and she turned her hand over and held his for the 2 seconds before he kneaded it back on the wheel. "We're fine," she said. "I know," he said. He drove the rest of the way with one hand. Aurora was born at 11:47 in the morning, weighing 7 pounds and 2 ounces, with a quantity of dark hair that the delivery nurse declared exceptional, and a voice that made its presence known in the room with what Selene could only describe as complete conviction. Adrian held her first. He'd been beside the bed through all of it, the long hours of labor, the particular physical intimacy of the process, the moments that stripped away every layer of controlled composure and left him as purely present as she'd ever seen him, his hand in hers through contractions, his voice, low and consistent, saying her name when she needed to hear something anchor her back into her own body. When the nurse placed Aurora in his arms, his face did something she had no adequate description for. Not the almost smile, not the full smile. Something that came from a deeper register than either. The expression of a man encountering something that revealed, without warning, the full dimensions of what he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. He looked at Aurora the way people looked at things that restructured their understanding of what the world contained. He didn't say anything for almost a full minute. When he looked up at Selene, his eyes were wet. He didn't try to manage it or contain it or apply any of the usual architecture. He just looked at her with his daughter in his arms and his face completely open and let the feeling be visible. "Hi," he said, to Aurora. Barely a sound. Selene watched his face. She thought, this is the thing that survived everything. Not the empire, not the inheritance or the legal proceedings or the 11 months of institutional machinery. This, the specific warmth of the room, the snow still falling outside the window, a man holding his daughter for the first time with his face entirely undefended. This was what the warehouse had been for. This was what the courthouse and the hotel room and the kitchen island and the 2-second kiss had all been building toward without their knowledge. This ordinary, extraordinary room, this child, this moment. She reached up and touched his face. He turned to look at her, and she could see both things in his expression simultaneously. Aurora and her, held together with the same quality of attention, no hierarchy between them, just the complete presence of a man who had decided, somewhere in the last 11 months, that being present was the only thing that mattered. "Hi," she said, to both of them. Chechen. The Vale family estate was ready by the following spring. Not finished? It was a 19th century brick structure with 4 acres and a century of accumulated weight, and it would probably never be finished, which Selene had come to understand was not a flaw but the nature of certain kinds of houses. The rooms they needed were ready. The chair was gone. The photograph of Mara Vale and Victor remained on the mantel but had been joined by others. Aurora at 3 weeks, squinting against daylight. Selene and Adrian in the restructured estate garden. A photograph she didn't know was being taken, both of them looking at something outside the frame. A photograph from the courthouse that she'd thought didn't exist until Adrian produced it from somewhere. The 2-second kiss, captured by a security camera, grainy and unposed and more honest than anything a photographer would have taken. She found it one morning in a frame on the kitchen windowsill. She stood looking at it for a while. She didn't ask when he'd put it there. Vivian Vale's supervised release began in the 10th month. She did not contact Adrian. She did not appear at any proceeding, any meeting, any communication channel that intersected with the Vale Holdings restructuring. She had, from everything Selene could determine, left New Carthage entirely, relocated to somewhere that was not in any document she'd seen, which, given Vivian's fundamental competence, was probably exactly as untraceable as she'd intended. There was a moment in the 12th month when Selene considered reaching out. She thought about it for 2 days. Thought about the warehouse and the detonator and the specific quality of Vivian's voice when she'd described what Victor did to people. Thought about what it would mean to extend something. Not forgiveness, which felt like too large a claim, but acknowledgement. Recognition that the woman in that warehouse had been both perpetrator and instrument, and that both of those things had consequences, and that the consequences had arrived, and that what came after consequences was something each person had to locate for themselves. She decided against reaching out, not because she'd resolved the question, because she understood that some questions didn't resolve. They settled slowly the way sediment settled, still present, visible if you looked, but no longer disturbing the water every time you moved through it. She let it settle. Victor Vale's trial lasted 6 weeks. She attended 2 days of it. The first day, when the federal prosecutor outlined the scope of the case, 14 years of documented operation, the specific financial architecture of the criminal holdings, the names and dates and dollar amounts that gave the jury a geography of what had been built and why it had to be dismantled. She sat in the gallery and listened and felt nothing she hadn't already processed, which told her the 11 months had done their work. The second day she attended was the day Victor gave his own testimony. He was still composed. That was the thing she noticed first, that even now, under cross-examination in a federal courtroom, he maintained the specific quality of unhurried authority that had characterized every interaction she'd had with him. Not arrogance, exactly. The settled manner of a man who had always understood himself to be the most significant person in any room. Under cross-examination, the composure showed its seams. The prosecutor, a woman in her 40s named Carla Osei, who had the specific patience of someone who had spent decades waiting for exactly the right moment to ask exactly the right question, walked Victor through the timeline of the documents Ana Ruiz had witnessed. The 14 months before Mara Vale's diagnosis, the financial instruments prepared in advance, the 2-year placement of Teresa Vance in the clinic. "You were building this," Osei said, "before your sister was ill." That characterization, you were planning the succession maneuver before there was a succession event to maneuver around. Victor looked at the prosecutor. "My sister's health was... I'm asking about the documents, Mr. Vale. The ones prepared 14 months before her diagnosis." A pause. "I was managing contingencies," he said. "Whose contingencies?" "The organization's. The organization's contingencies included placing an asset inside a private medical facility." "The organization required..." "Whose contingencies, Mr. Vale?" The composure held one moment longer, then something behind it gave way. Not dramatically, not the way things gave way in films with swelling music and visible tears. Quietly. A small interior collapse visible only in the slight shift around his eyes, the almost imperceptible softening of the jaw. "Mine," he said. The courtroom was quiet. Selene looked at him. At the specific diminishment of a man who had spent years building an architecture of control and had finally been made to say, in a room full of witnesses, that the architecture had served only himself. She didn't feel satisfied. She felt tired in a way that was also, underneath, something adjacent to relief. The specific exhaustion of a long thing being over. She left before the session concluded. Victor was convicted on 11 counts. She heard the verdict by phone, standing in the estate garden with Aurora on her hip, watching the apple trees that had gone wild along the eastern fence, and that she'd decided to keep rather than trim because there was something she liked about the wildness, about the proof that things could survive neglect and still produce something worth keeping. She thanked Marcus for calling. She ended the call. She stood in the garden with Aurora, who was 4 months old and had developed a specific interest in the quality of light through leaves, tracking it with the focused attention of someone doing important work. "That's done," Selene said, to herself or to Aurora or to the garden, some combination. Aurora reached up and grabbed a strand of her hair and held on with the particular conviction of someone who had decided this was the most important thing happening anywhere. Selene laughed. She walked back toward the house. Dick, the rooftop of the Harrow Tower in late June. They'd kept the penthouse. It was still Adrian's primary office space, still the nerve center of the restructured Vale Holdings, still the place where the city was visible from every angle in the way that the estate's 4 acres did not provide. The penthouse was work. The estate was home. Both of these things were true, and neither of them required the other to be false. The rooftop had been transformed since the legal proceedings ended. Not dramatically. Adrian had not been interested in dramatic gestures, which she appreciated, but incrementally. Planters along the north edge with lavender and rosemary, and something she kept meaning to identify but hadn't. A small area of grass that was slightly too green to be natural, which she teased him about and which he maintained was perfectly natural, which she knew was untrue and chose not to press. It was where they came when the day's wait needed somewhere to go. Tonight was warm. The city glittered below in its enormous ambivalent way. All those lights, all those lives, the specific democracy of a skyline that didn't know or care what had been survived in its shadow. Aurora was inside with the woman they'd hired to help, asleep as of 30 minutes ago in the room that had been designed around her with the specific attention of 2 people who had learned, through 11 months of uncertainty, to take nothing about the future for granted. Selene leaned against the rooftop railing. Adrian stood beside her. She was carrying the second pregnancy differently than the first. Higher, she thought, though the obstetrician had gently noted that this was not actually how pregnancy worked, and that she was simply noticing her own body more carefully. She was 8 weeks along. She had told Adrian the morning after the test, standing at the kitchen island, which was the order of things now. First, immediately, without calibration. He had put down his coffee and looked at her for a long moment, and then said very quietly, "Okay," in exactly the way he'd said it the first time, with the same quality of complete and uncomplicated commitment, and she had felt it land in her chest in the same way, warm and absolute. "I keep thinking about something," she said. He looked at her. "That first night, after I signed the documents, I was in the guest room and I was telling myself this was a business arrangement and I was going to be completely fine and it was going to be completely professional." She looked at the city. "And I believed it. I actually believed it." "So did I," he said. "Did you?" He thought about it honestly, which was one of the things she'd come to rely on in him, that when she asked him something directly, he didn't reach for the comfortable answer first. "No," he said. "I told myself I believed it. That's different." "What were you actually thinking?" "That I had exactly the outcome I wanted, and no right to want anything further, and that I was going to be an adult about it and maintain the arrangement professionally and never say a single word about any of it." He paused. "I was wrong about all of that. Catastrophically wrong," she said. "Your word, not mine. It was your word first, in the hotel room." "Was it?" "You said we'd both been catastrophically stupid." He considered. "That does sound like something I would say." She looked at him. The city light on his face, the cut above his eye, healed now to a thin scar that would probably stay. The specific quality of the way he looked at her, attentive and present, and not managing any distance between himself and the fact of her, that she had watched develop over the last year from something he'd been practicing into something that was simply how he was. "I'm glad you called me that night," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I almost didn't," he said. "I know. I sat in the dark for 2 hours before I called." "I know." She'd worked this out over time, from things he'd said, from the quality of his voice when he'd finally spoken. "What made you do it?" He looked out at the city. "I kept thinking about what it would cost me to let you go back to your life without saying anything." He paused. "Not the empire, not the succession, just you. Going back to your apartment, and your work, and your life, and me continuing to exist at a professional distance from you for another however many years." He looked at her. "It was the only thing that actually frightened me." She held that. "The only thing," she said. "I've been in rooms with people who wanted to kill me," he said. "That was never—" He stopped. "You were always the only thing I was actually afraid of losing." The city hummed below them. The lavender and the planters moved slightly in the warm night air. Somewhere inside the penthouse, Aurora slept in her room with the nightlight her father had selected with the same focused attention he brought to everything. A soft amber glow, not too bright, adjustable. Selene turned to face him. She put her hand against his chest, felt his heartbeat under her palm. Steady and fast, the way it always was when she stood close to him, the body refusing to be managed regardless of what the face was doing. "No contracts," she said. He looked at her. "No contracts. No conditions. None. Just this." He put his hand over hers, the one over his heart. "Just this," he said. He kissed her the way you kiss someone after a year of everything. Not urgently, not tentatively, but with the full and unhurried weight of a person who understood, finally, completely, that there was nowhere else to be, and no better version of this moment available anywhere and nothing to manage or contain or protect against. She kissed him back the same way. Below them, New Carthage went on being what it was. Vast and indifferent and beautiful and lit from within by millions of lives being lived in all their ordinary and extraordinary dimensions. None of them aware that on a rooftop above the financial district, a woman was standing with her hand over a man's heart, and her eyes closed, and the city wind moving through her hair, and the specific feeling, rare and hard-won and entirely unwilling to be anything other than what it was, of having arrived somewhere she intended to stay. The empire that had tried to bury them was gone. What remained was worth more than anything Mara Vale had written into a document, more than any condition or clause or legal architecture designed to control what came after her. What remained was this: a rooftop, a city, a man who had finally learned to say what he meant, a woman who had finally learned to say it first, a daughter asleep inside with her father's dark hair and her mother's particular quality of focused attention, already navigating the world with the full conviction of someone who had decided, in the wordless logic of the newly arrived, that everything within reach was worth examining. And underneath all of it, quiet, deep, nothing like the desperate thing it had been at 2:13 in the morning on a rain-soaked night in a dark penthouse. The truth that had survived everything they'd put it through. Not because it was easy. Not because they'd been careful with it, or strategic about it, or managed it correctly from the beginning, because they'd chosen it, again and again, even when it cost them, especially then,